1. How does social psychology differ from related disciplines such as personality psychology and sociology? How might a social psychologist, in contrast to researchers in other disciplines, try to understand the atrocities at Abu Ghraib? So personality psychology looks at the individual and individual differences. Sociology looks at groups themselves. So the object of study of social psychology is individuals within a group, how a group influences individuals' thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So it's kind of like overlaps between personality psychology and sociology. How might a social psychologist try to understand the atrocities of Abu Ghraib versus researchers in other disciplines? So a social psychologist wouldn't see the soldiers at Abu Ghraib as like bad apples, like maybe a personality psychologist might. And a sociologist might look at like groupthink maybe, but a social psychologist could look at like the Zimbardo experiment and see how like the social context made or was like very conducive, like having authority was very conducive to like the mistreatment, like the social context itself created the mistreatment. 2. What does the Milgram experiment on obedience demonstrate about the power of the situation? What features of the experimental situation might have increased the likelihood that participants would continue to shock the learner even after the learner showed signs of pain? So what does the Milgram experiment demonstrate about the power of the situation? Well, it demonstrates that authority is like very powerful. In the likelihood that the participants would continue to shock the learner even after the learner showed signs of pain, that was increased by things like the idea, like the language was changed to like very benign language, and the idea of an experiment, the idea of a scientist in a white lab coat made it seem very like harmless, even though the situation itself was not harmless. 3. Why are schemas so important for social interaction? What is your schema for being a student in a classroom? What might happen if you didn't have that schema? So schemas, they're like basically your memories of similar situations that you bring to mind when confronting a new situation in order to navigate it, almost like a script. So they're very important, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you go through a social situation. You kind of know how it will play out, and you know your role in it. What is your schema for being a student in a classroom? Be quiet, be respectful, be polite, look interested, make eye contact with your professor, ask questions if you have concerns, don't use your phone. What might happen if you didn't have that schema? You might get kicked out of the classroom for being disruptive. You might not learn as much. 4. When trying to understand people's thoughts, feelings, and motivations, why don't researchers just ask them? What does research on automatic versus controlled processing tell us about people's awareness of their own mental states? So you can't just ask people about their thoughts, feelings, and motivations because a lot of it is non-conscious. So like they're not aware of it, so they couldn't communicate it. What does research on automatic versus controlled processing tell us about people's awareness of their own mental states? So when you are using automatic processing, which is quick and effortless, it's more like a reflex based on emotions. And so you're not totally aware of like what your brain is, why it's making the decisions that it is. It's like implicit. So in controlled processing, which is like serial, you're processing one thing at a time versus automatic processing, which is in parallel. It can be many things at the same time. Then you're like aware of your own mental state. However, a lot of our processing is automatic and unconscious. 5. How does evolution help explain social behavior? What are some types of behaviors that seem most likely to be explained by evolution, and what behaviors seem less likely? Evolution is the idea that humans have adapted to their environments over thousands of years, and that these adaptations can be universal and also cultural and ecologically dependent. But basically, like, the past and the environments of the past have determined how humans think and behave and feel and function in society, especially as social organisms. We function in groups to survive. What are some types of behaviors that seem most likely to be explained by evolution, and what behaviors seem less likely? So, behavior that is likely to be explained by evolution is the parental investment theory, which is the idea that women invest more into having a finite number of offspring, and men can have infinite offspring, so women value and get more benefit from their offspring, and so they're more invested. What behaviors seem less likely to be explained by evolution? Well, personality traits are less likely to be explained by evolution because those are individual differences. 6. What is the naturalistic fallacy, and why is it so important to avoid when considering evolutionary explanations? So the naturalistic fallacy is the idea that what does happen is what should happen. It's important when considering evolutionary explanations because, this is not the case. Like, if humans are predisposed to certain behaviors, that doesn't make them right. Like violence, humans are predisposed to, but violence has been declining for the last 500 years, and that's a good thing. We don't have to do something just because we're predisposed to it. 7. How do Western and Eastern countries differ in their beliefs about the role of the self in relation to the group? How might these beliefs lead to different behaviors in an academic setting? So in the Western world, we're individualistic, and in the Eastern world, they're collectivistic. So in the Western world, it's about the individual, about freedoms, about self-actualization, looser social connections and less social connections, less hierarchy, more equal judgment for everyone. In the Eastern world, it is more collectivistic, so they adhere to hierarchies more, care more about interpersonal relationships, and roles such that come from like age or gender and their family. How might these beliefs lead to different behaviors in an academic setting? Well, individual success might be more important. Well, individual success is important for collectivistic and individual cultures. For individualistic people, it's more important to like personal success. Whereas like if you're from from a collectivistic culture, you may want to do well to make your family proud. Competitiveness might be higher in individualistic cultures in school, and social cohesion and cooperation and teamwork might be higher in the Eastern collectivistic world in school. 8. Are evolutionary and cultural explanations for behavior compatible? How might these two perspectives complement each other when it comes to explaining gender differences in mate selection? So evolutionary and cultural explanations for behavior are compatible. How do they complement each other when it comes to explaining gender differences in mate selection? So mate selection could be influenced by culture and ecology, like what the culture deems appropriate based on their ecology, about who to marry, when to marry, whether it's polygynous or polyandrous, and gender differences in mate selection from an evolutionary perspective is the idea that because men can have infinite offspring and lots of sexual partners, it doesn't really care, and they don't have to raise a child necessarily. They don't really care who they choose as a partner so much, but they privilege like sexual contact, whereas women have to choose a male partner more carefully because they need help protecting with protection, especially for their child, and financial or like food gathering assistance from their male partner to help raise themselves, to help raise the child and potentially to help themselves.